Mr. Torres is recognized.
Thank you. When interest rates rise, long-term securities become less valuable, but deposits become more valuable. If you have a stable deposit base, the gains from the deposits can offset the losses from long-term securities. But if you have an unstable deposit base, like Silicon Valley Bank, there's no built-in offset. Silicon Valley Bank had a uniquely uninsured, unstable deposit base that made it singularly susceptible to a bank run in the age of social media. So, Vice Chair Barr, should a bank with an unstable, uninsured deposit base like SVB be subject to a higher standard of regulation than a bank with a stable, insured deposit base?
Representative Torres, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think you described the situation exactly correctly. And the unique
Flattery will win you no points, but sure.
It's just the truth. I wish I had said it that way. But no, I think there are unique risks to this kind of heavy uninsured deposit base. And for most banks in the country, as you described, they handle their interest rate risk properly. They have stable deposits. I know all of you, and when you talk to your banks and you go back home across the country, they're doing okay.
But you agree that the rigor of regulation should depend not only on size, but on deposit stability, yes?
I do.
Regarding commercial real estate, the rapid rise of work from home during COVID has driven down office property values, and the rapid rise of interest rates have driven up financing costs, creating a perfect storm. Office buildings with declining property values are set to be refinanced at far higher interest rates. There's reportedly $2.5 trillion in commercial real estate debt coming due over the next 5 years, a substantial share of which is office debt. Chair Gruenberg, to what extent do you worry about the office loan portfolio representing a ticking time bomb in the banking system?
It presents a risk. It's one the FDIC has talked about and identified publicly.
And Signature was the largest commercial real estate lender in New York City. How much of Signature's commercial real estate portfolio consists of office real estate?
That's a good question. Let me get you the exact note. It's a substantial portion of it.
Can you get me back an answer in writing?
I can get that for you.
More important to me locally, residential real estate. Signature Bridge Bank has a housing portfolio of 3,000 properties consisting of 80,000 units in New York City. The portfolio includes 479 properties consisting of 19,000 units in the Bronx, where I serve as a congressman. I have two questions for the FDIC. As you go through the process of seeking a buyer for Signature's residential real estate debt, to what extent will you seek the input of New York State and New York City housing officials who have an obvious stake in preserving the affordability of these properties and units? And to what extent will you prioritize affordable housing preservation in your selection of a purchaser?
Thank you, Congressman. Just to be clear, we have sold Signature to New York Community Bank.
You sold everything but the real estate portfolio, as I understand. That's been publicly reported.
I take your point. No, we'll be glad to work with you and other local officials in New York in regard to the disposition.
I appreciate that commitment.
Sure.
I'm not advocating the following course of action, but I want to provide you with a hypothetical. The banking system is reportedly sitting on more than $600 billion in unrealized losses from securities, and those losses will only rise with rising interest rates. Since the problem with these assets is one of asset duration rather than asset quality, should the Federal Reserve consider purchasing these securities? Unlike a bank, which needs liquidity to honor obligations to depositors, the Federal Reserve has the ability to hold these assets to a maturity without realizing those unrealized losses. Wouldn't that solve the problem?
You raise an excellent point. Under existing law, we cannot do asset purchases. But what we do is provide ample liquidity to the financial system on the basis of those
But the
assets.
losses remain, even with the emergency liquidity, the losses remain on the balance sheet. Those losses are arguably undercutting public confidence in the banking system. And as you know, banking is as much about psychology as it is about finance. Why not just remove the losses?
I'd go back to the first point you made in your earlier question, which is that for most banks, they're managing this well. They're doing fine. They have stable deposits, and they don't need to sell the assets they have on their balance sheet. Those assets can stay there and be held to maturity. If institutions need liquidity, they can get access to that from the discount window, and from the program we established, the Bank Term Funding Program gives longer-term stability at par for those very assets.
I want to squeeze in one more question. Did the bank supervisor at the San Francisco Fed have the supervisory authority to prevent Silicon Valley Bank from investing in unhedged long-term securities? Did you have that authority? Like, is the problem a lack of authority or a failure to exercise the authority you had?
The bank examiners cited them for not behaving properly with respect.
But did they have the authority to prevent it?
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman can answer on the record. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chairman Powell. As you know, the U.S. has foreign adversaries, particularly the CCP, that seem intent on de-dollarization. How seriously should the threat of de-dollarization be taken, in your view?
Well, the status of the United States, of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, is a very important thing to us. I think the reason we have that status is largely due to our great democratic institutions, the rule of law, and the fact that we have, generally speaking, had strong levels of price stability. And I think that the dollar will remain the reserve currency as long as those things are in place.
Well, I want to explore that answer, because commentators often speak of the dollar as the world's reserve currency as the cause of America's economic dominance. Do you think of it as the cause of America's economic dominance or as a consequence of it?
To me, it's more of a consequence. And also, there tends to be an equilibrium where one currency becomes the accepted global standard, and that has been the dollar for some time, and I expect that it will be for some time, continue to be.
It's often said that the Fed has a dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability. Do you view these mandates as equally binding upon the Fed, or does one supersede the other?
They are perfectly equal under the law.
And I'm curious to know what it means in practice to have a 2% inflation target. The latest pause notwithstanding, does it mean the Federal Reserve will continue raising interest rates until the 2% target is reached, even if doing so comes at the expense of maximum employment as well as financial stability?
No, it doesn't mean that. It does not. So the way we think about it is most of the time the two goals are aligned in the sense that if you're achieving one, you're achieving the other, and if you're a little bit off, the other one, they move in the same direction. Today's situation is unusual in that we are overachieving, in effect, the maximum employment goal, but we are far from achieving the inflation goal. So in our system, we have a constitutional document, and what it says is that when that's the case, you look at how far you are from the goal, and you look at the speed with which you would move back to the goal. And so that would tell you today that we should focus heavily on inflation, but as it becomes closer, as the two things become more aligned, then they go back into perfect equality under the law.
So the Fed engages in a delicate balancing act between employment and inflation.
Yes.
To what extent do you factor in financial stability, safety, and soundness when raising interest rates?
So you're right. We do have a financial stability mandate, but we try to.
Well, you have a financial stability mandate with respect to your role as a bank regulator. But when it comes to
also just generally, we're the lender of last resort. Central banks were originally created to support the financial system in times of stress and to make sure that you don't get into times of stress. So I would say that, sorry, what was your question before that? It was
to what extent do you factor in safety and soundness when setting interest rates?
Sorry. So we really try hard to use our financial stability tools for financial stability purposes and our monetary policy tools for monetary purposes. The reality on the ground is much messier than that. They're very much entangled, and one affects the other. So the separation is not at all perfect. But we do think of these as separate things with separate tools.
Do you think that the Silicon Valley bank failure revealed a deeper tension between the safety and soundness mandate of the Fed as a bank regulator and the mandate of the Fed as a administrator of monetary policy?
I would say no, and I'll tell you why. Interest rate risk is one of the most basic banking risks. We supervise for it. Overwhelmingly, U.S. banks did manage their interest rate risk. Silicon Valley Bank didn't, and even though we were, the supervisors were pointing that out to them, they just didn't take, the bank didn't take action quickly enough. So I would have thought that you can say that it was interest rate hikes that caused portfolio losses, but it was management that failed to hedge against those losses and failed to hold appropriate liquidity.
In the pre-COVID world, we had the best of both worlds: low unemployment, low inflation for decades. Do you believe that we could return to that best of both worlds, or are high interest rates a new normal in the American economy?
So we will return to 2% inflation and maximum employment. What will be the level of interest rates there? That's a really good question, and
Do you suspect it's going to settle at a higher level than we've known historically?
I think it's really hard to know. You know, it's a great question. We talk about this a lot. The people who argue that they will move it back down just point to the fact that it was really global factors that drove rates down in the first place. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Gentleman's time
Hard
has
to know.
expired. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Torres.
Thank you. I had prepared questions, but I actually might want to follow up on the colloquy that Undersecretary Crittenbrink had with the chairman. The chairman asked you exactly how are the actions of the administration unprecedented, and I might want to take a crack at answering that question. It seems to me that the unprecedented nature of the administration's actions should be seen not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. It should be seen holistically. And when you consider the historic export controls on advanced semiconductors, which are the most critical of critical technologies, which will have implications far beyond semiconductors, implications for AI and quantum computing and just about every form of emerging technology. When you consider the historic security alliance between the United States and Australia, in which we're equipping Australia with nuclear submarines, when you consider the expansion of military bases in the Philippines and the rapprochement between Japan and South Korea, and the historic remilitarization of Japan, a development not seen since World War II. Japan's defense budget has gone from 1% to 2%. It seems to me the sum total of all of those actions, especially in the backyard of China, would seem to exceed anything that any administration has previously done to deter China. And China does not perceive these actions as weakness, it perceives these actions as containment. So is that a fair description of the unprecedented approach that the administration has taken?
Congressman, I agree with you 100%.
And I also want to examine the notion that diplomacy as practiced by the Biden administration is a form of weakness. It seems to me there ought to be a communicative relationship between the two leading superpowers in the world. Even during the peak of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a channel of crisis communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. My concern is that a lack of communication could mean that we're one incident away, one miscalculation away from a catastrophic outbreak of war. So is that a fair assessment of the need for diplomacy between the two leading superpowers in the world?
Absolutely. We believe that we're strong, we're confident, we're also responsible, and that's why we're pursuing those communication channels.
And I want to examine the notion that the delay in the controls, the investment controls, is also somehow a function of weakness. It seems to me that getting these controls right is not an exact science. I mean, we have to figure out how do we limit China's competitiveness without undermining our own competitiveness, right? We want to impose controls on China, but not provoke a response that's so retaliatory that it does us more harm than good. So that, to me, is not about weakness. That's about figuring out the right balancing act. Is that a fair description of what's happening within the administration?
What I would say, Congressman, is we believe we have to be strong, we have to be robust. We also have to be very smart and very strategic, and to make sure that we understand precisely the impact of our actions and make sure that they land with maximum effect.
I feel like we often use buzzwords to describe our approach to China. Strategic decoupling, de-risking, and I wonder, have we gone beyond the buzzwords? Do we have an actual plan for de-risking the relationship with China? Do we have an actual timeline for de-risking? Because we are dangerously dependent on China for critical minerals, rare earth elements, clean energy technologies, active pharmaceutical ingredients. Do we have plans and timelines for de-risking in each of these areas?
Maybe I'll take an initial stab at that, Congressman. I can't say that I have a specific timeline by which we will reach X goal, but absolutely de-risking is our strategy. And to the previous comment, there are obviously challenges in our
But shouldn't we have It seems to me we need actual plans that make de-risking a reality.
We're
and we need timelines by which we hold ourselves accountable.
We're absolutely pursuing de-risking. We've argued here there are benefits to trade. There are more than 700,000 American jobs that depend on exports to China. What we can't continue, though, is vulnerabilities in our supply chains that make us and our partners vulnerable to either disruption or, for our partners, coercion. And we are very aggressively.
And I noticed there's been a shift in language from strategic decoupling to de-risking. Is there a difference between the two? What's the difference between the two?
Well, the argument is somehow decoupling or ceasing all
No,
trade.
not all trade, strategic decoupling and de-risking. That's a nice sleight of hand, but no.
All I can say is our policy is to pursue de-risking, which is, again, to
Is there a difference between the two, yes or no?
I'll have to take that back and come back to you, Congressman.
I'd like a response on that, too.
Yes, sir.
That's a great question. Mr. Whitman.
Everyone has a right to say things in this country. There's a freedom of speech issue. But at the same time, colleagues can also express their displeasure. And right now, with everything going on, using a phrase that is well known, calling for the elimination of an entire country right after they faced one of their worst terrorist attacks in their history, one of the worst terrorist attacks in the world's history. It was important for us to say that's just not acceptable.
It is outrageous. I am embarrassed for those Democrats who voted to censure their own colleague, who voted against free speech. It is an embarrassment.
Okay. Thank you.
Look, if you're advocating for the creation of a Palestinian state, that is fair game. That falls well within the realm of reasonable discourse. But when you're uttering phrases like from the river to the sea, you're not simply advocating for the creation of a Palestinian state, you're advocating for the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. And that crosses a line that no member of Congress should ever cross. It's hate speech, and Congress has a right to condemn it.
Thank you. My name is. My name. My name is Ritchie Torres. One of my local rabbis calls me Ritchie Torah. And I'm from the Bronx. I proudly represent the neighborhood of Riverdale. Wonderful schools like SAR. But today I'm not here only as a Bronxite. I'm not here only as a New Yorker. I am here as an American to defend one of our greatest American values, the U.S.-Israel relationship. The U.S.-Israel relationship is not just a Democratic or Republican value. It's not just a progressive or conservative value. It is an American value encoded in our national DNA. October 7th was a crime against the Jewish state, indeed against humanity, so barbaric that it cannot be ignored. It cannot go unpunished. Hamas must be brought to justice. Israel has a right to defend itself, and America has a duty to stand with Israel in her struggle for survival and self-defense. Israel must do to Hamas what the United States did to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the 21st century. We must do to Hamas what we did to the Nazis in the 20th century. We must rid the world of the terrorism and barbarism that was perpetrated against humanity and the Jewish people. Now, we know that the narrative has shifted against Israel. Israel is the only country on earth whose existence, whose legitimacy, whose right of self-defense is the target for both delegitimation and destruction. No one expected the United States to enter into a ceasefire with the Empire of Japan when 2,400 Americans were murdered in Pearl Harbor. No one expected the United States to enter into a ceasefire with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban when 3,000 Americans were murdered on 9/11. And so those who insist that Israel should no longer defend itself are holding the Jewish state to a dangerous double standard that no other country, including the United States, would ever impose on itself. I want to be crystal clear. A ceasefire with a terrorist organization is not a peace agreement. It is a death sentence for Israelis. Now, not everyone who's calling for a ceasefire wants Israel to cease to exist, but everyone who wants Israel to cease to exist is calling for a ceasefire. Hamas and Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic of Iran are all calling for a ceasefire. Our answer to them is no. 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of Israel and the 60th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. And those two anniversaries remind me that the Jewish people have long had a dream of Jewish liberation. Theodore Herzl had a dream of emancipation from anti-Semitism. The Jews who were driven into exile for thousands of years had a dream of one day returning to their homeland. And so we are here to tell the world that Israel is the realization of a dream. Israel is the manifestation of the words, never again. Israel is the realization of a dream that will live on for the next 75 years and beyond. Israel high. Thank you.
Congressman Ritchie Torres.
You know, yesterday George Santos said that he refuses to go to the back of the room or the back of the bus. And, you know, it's plausible that Mr. Santos is so delusional that he's mistaking himself for Rosa Parks. But he is not a victim here. We're the victim of his fraudulent behavior. You know, Senator Mitt Romney spoke for the majority of Americans. He spoke for both Democrats and Republicans when he referred to George Santos as a sick man. There is something sick about a man who lies about his mother dying on 9/11, who lies about his employees dying in the Pulse mass shooting, who lies about his ancestors surviving the Holocaust, who lies about struggling with brain cancer. There's something sick about a man who not only lies pathologically, but violates almost every law imaginable: House ethics, campaign finance law, securities law. And so we're here to send a clear message that if Kevin McCarthy refuses to hold George Santos accountable, we will. We will hold George Santos accountable for conduct unbecoming of a congressman. We are going to expel George Santos because he is a deep rot at the very core of the United States Congress. In a country of 330 million people, only 535 have the high honor of serving in the United States Congress. One of those people should not be George Santos, period.
Absolutely. And
Now go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
It's always a pleasure to see you, Director, and I have found you to be as impressively communicative and responsive as any agency head in the federal government. So thank you for your commitment to protecting working people from predatory fees. My first question is about remittances. You know, I represent a district in the Bronx where families have to pay excessive fees in order to transfer their own money to loved ones abroad. And the high fees and long delays of the existing remittance system imposes a hardship on the lowest income Americans, particularly immigrants. And as a nation of immigrants, as you know, the United States is by far the largest source of remittances, $72 billion in 2021 alone. In your view, what can and should be done to create a better, cheaper, and faster remittance system for the most vulnerable among us?
Well, there's so much. One, we need to make sure that the existing providers are not engaged in bait and switch, that they're telling the truth about how much it's cost and they're not hiding things with junk fees. But I think with digitization, we've also got to think more broadly. Lots of you have constituents who send money abroad. I see how in big commercial contexts, there are often agreements between large banks, between central banks. We should be thinking about the plumbing of the financial system so that people can send things cheaply and safely. And I think that requires the attention of us, the Federal Reserve Board, and many others.
I have a question about blockchain and stablecoin in the context of remittances. Blockchain can enable real-time transactions, stablecoin can digitize the dollar. Do you believe that the combination of blockchain and stablecoin, if properly regulated, has the potential to play a role in creating a better, cheaper, and faster remittance system?
Yeah, we've seen that actually some digital apps and other products have been able to actually help people send money to a family member who's in a very remote area. They may not actually live near a bank or a place that has a remittance provider, and are sometimes able to use that in ways that really kind of bridge so much divide. Now, on the underlying technology, obviously it's complicated. We want to make sure that it is well regulated, that there's not fraud, that people have a fair sense of what it is, but I'm totally open to working with all of you as you think through that.
Much has been said about AI. AI is the most revolutionary technology of our time. I have found the discourse about AI to be pessimistic to the point of apocalyptic. And so I'm curious, what do you see not only as the greatest risk, but also the greatest reward of AI when it comes to consumer protection in the field of financial services?
Yeah, so look, in some ways, AI is not totally new. It's really advanced computational methods. There's lots of good ways to prevent fraud. There may be ways in which you could detect some sort of error in your finances, help you automatically dispute something. There's certainly going to be consumer use cases. I think a little bit of where we should be cautious is throwing it out into the world and just kind of seeing what happens. I think we should be thoughtful about how are the different use cases, generative AI and copying of biometric data, lending and how it would work in algorithms. So we should be precise on it, but I think there are opportunities. I'm not apocalyptic, but I want to make sure we're being cautious.
Is CFPB exploring how to harness the power of AI to enhance enforcement?
Yeah, I think we are always looking at more advanced tools on how we analyze our complaint data, other data to detect and deter wrongdoing, just as other law enforcement does.
On the subject of crypto regulation, the agencies that typically come to mind are CFTC and SEC. What is, could, or should be the role of CFPB in the field of crypto regulation?
Yeah, so it's less about the underlying technology and more about the use case. There has not been a huge intersection, but certainly if you have a stable coin that very rapidly scales on one of these payment apps, like another consumer payment, that's certainly a consumer use case there. So that's a real place that we are watching it. But most of the other uses that we see in the financial markets are indeed outside of consumer financial products.
And so what are your existing authorities with respect to stablecoin regulation?
So the relevant ones that come up a lot are the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, which is kind of fraud, movement of digital money, privacy, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act privacy provisions, but there's some other ones that get implicated as well.
I see my time has expired. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
Work with. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When it comes to the struggle to win the hearts and minds of the international community, particularly the Global South, China seems to have a natural advantage over the United States. China has an authoritarian message that resonates naturally with authoritarian regimes. Right? China can easily tell those regimes, unlike the United States, we, the CCP, will never sit in judgment of you. America will come to you and give you a lecture, we will come to you and give you infrastructure. And tragically, we live in a world where there are more autocracies than democracies, and those autocracies seem ideologically predisposed to buy what China is selling. So, Mr. Garnott, what can the U.S. do to overcome the appeal of China's autocratic messaging to autocratic regimes?
This is a real challenge, China's ability to co-opt elites. I think that is the fundamental problem here. And in my view, the most important thing is to illuminate improper financial dealings and to the extent that that's possible, to cut off the grey income flows to elites in countries where institutions are not robust. If you cut off the bribery, then I think Beijing would be less popular in many countries.
You know, China's known for exercising both discourse power and economic coercion, and these two seem to be mutually reinforcing. So take a recent example is Elon Musk, who owns and operates X, formerly known as Twitter, and who has considerable business interest in China. In a recent interview with Andrew Ross Sorkin of the New York Times, Mr. Musk had colorful language for advertisers fleeing his social media platform X. Without quoting him verbatim, he essentially told his advertisers to go to hell. Ms. Wang, do you think Musk would deliver the same kind of tough talk to the CCP?
Well, I mean, a good anecdote or evidence that he wouldn't is that, I mean, Elon Musk tweets constantly when he's in the US, right? But when he visited in China earlier this year, he was completely silent for, I think, at least like a day or two when he was in China, because Twitter is banned in China. So he's apparently complying with Chinese laws, complying with Chinese practice of not accessing Twitter. I mean, Elon Musk has, publicly said he thinks that Taiwan should be part of China. So there are rhetorics that clearly shows, I mean, he, ideologically aligned with the CCP. And also...
And Mr. Musk also said that he is committed to core socialist values. Do you think he's actually committed to core socialist values, or does he feel coerced by the economic and discourse power of the CCP?
Well, I think economics definitely, in the back of his mind, just because of the huge interests he has in China. And, a lot of companies have interests in the U.S., Chinese company or American companies. But the American government doesn't, coerce or leverage that for foreign companies' access to the U.S. government. American government doesn't even have the power to tie political goals to business access. But the Chinese government can do that. So that's a very powerful tool to compel foreign companies to do that. I mean, Elon Musk had, Tesla. China is Tesla's second market, and Tesla's Shanghai factory is the world's largest electrical factory.
Dr. Yu, I found myself struck by the following statement in your testimony, quote, "The propagandists determined to undermine America's confidence are aided and abetted by our country's self-denunciation, from opinion-setting editorial boards to opinion-forming classrooms that only see vice in the world's oldest continuous democracy, but ignore systemic and inherent goodness at its core." Eloquently put. I share the view that there seems to be an American culture of self-loathing spreading virally on social media platforms and college campuses. And it's hard to imagine more compelling evidence of America's cultural self-loathing than the trending of Osama bin Laden's letter to America on TikTok. Do you agree with that assessment?
I agree. I think, one reason I said that, the way you read it actually sounds much better than I wrote it. Let me just put it this way.
I'm happy to read more of your testimony.
When Americans criticize our government, that shows our sense of responsibility. We wish this country to be a more perfect union, right? That's what I think. When the Chinese Communist government criticizes us, they want us destroyed. Because it doesn't matter which party is in charge. Democrats or Republican is not a policy per se. It's the very existence of the United States that could inspire Chinese people. That's what they fear about most. So that's why I think we should have self-confidence in ourselves and to believe the virtue of our democratic system is infinitely better than anything the Chinese Communist Party could offer. Back to the question you asked just a little bit earlier, in 20 seconds. ultimately, the Chinese model of governance would not prevail. You look at even Chinese American companies, how many were going in? No. Yes, Elon Musk is there, but a majority of the companies were already getting out. Showing up at this obsequious dinner in Silicon Valley for Xi Jinping are those people who already have their investment in China. But people who did not show up are the CEOs of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and AMD. Many companies didn't do that because they know China is not a very good environment for them to invest. As Secretary of Commerce Romano said, China essentially is uninvestable.
Thank you. Mr. Banks.
Dr. Yu, you played a leading role in the Trump administration's efforts to counter communist China.
And the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm just curious, Ms. Yentl, do you think providing every child with an education is a utopian dream?
I don't.
Do you believe providing every child with housing is a utopian dream?
No.
And do you believe, like education, no one can be reasonably expected to succeed in America without access to safe, decent, affordable housing?
Absolutely, and the research shows it again and again.
And on a personal level, I would not be in Congress were it not for public housing and the stability and opportunity it gave me and my family. My own life journey from public housing in the Bronx to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. is a product of public investment in affordable housing. And my Republican colleagues would have you believe that there is excessive government intervention in housing. Now, I will concede when it comes to land use, there is certainly exclusionary zoning, which has been a barrier to addressing the affordability crisis. But when it comes to funding, the Republican talking point could not be farther from the truth. The problem is not too much government investment in affordable housing. The problem is too little. There is insufficient housing supply and insufficient housing subsidy. What is the extent of the gap between the demand for affordable housing and the supply of affordable housing in the United States?
For households with the lowest income, there's a shortage of 7.3 million homes, affordable and available to them. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income households throughout the country, there are fewer than 4 apartments that are affordable to them. And if I could just say that we talk a lot about the cost of providing housing to be affordable for extremely low-income people, but we don't talk enough about the costs of inaction. It's not like if we're not providing housing for extremely low-income people, we're not paying. We are. We pay as a country to allow for homelessness and housing poverty to persist, and we pay for it through lowered educational attainment, through health challenges for children and families and increased health costs as a result, for families unable to obtain and retain well-paying jobs. There's a study from Children's Health Watch that shows over the next 10 years, we'll pay $111 billion in avoidable healthcare costs because we allow homelessness to continue to persist. So we're paying one way or another. I think a better use of funds is to invest in solutions to keep homes affordable for the lowest income people.
Right, so homelessness and housing insecurity are not only bad morals, it's bad economics.
That's right.
During COVID, we saw essential workers, many of them earning minimum wage, put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that the white-collar workforce could safely shelter in place and work from home. Is there a single county in America where an essential worker earning minimum wage could afford a one-bedroom apartment?
There are very, very few communities throughout the country where that's possible.
What about a two-bedroom apartment?
There's no community where it's
So out of 3,000 counties, there's not a single area in which an essential worker earning minimum wage could afford a two-bedroom apartment.
That's right.
And do you believe it's wise for Congress to stand by idly while America becomes dangerously unaffordable to its essential workforce?
No, housing is a basic human need, and as you said very well, people can't succeed in other areas of their lives if they don't have a home to go to at the end of the day. Children need a place to study, people need a place to unwind. All of us know the value of home in our lives, and we need to provide that for our essential workers, for everyone with extremely low incomes.
Because I do have a number of colleagues who seem intent on substituting free market fundamentalism for evidence-based policy. Is there any evidence at all that the free market, if left to its own devices, unaided by any government subsidy, can magically create the affordable housing that we need at the levels of affordability that we need?
No, in fact, the evidence very clearly says the opposite.
So suppose there were no government intervention in the form of public housing. Would there be less or more housing insecurity and homelessness?
More.
What if there were no Section 8?
More.
What if there were no LIHTC or tax-exempt bond financing or CRA credits?
All of these are essential ways that the federal government provides resources to ensure that some people with extremely low incomes can stay stably housed, but the funding is far under the need. The federal government only provides funding for every 1 in every 4 households who needs housing assistance and is eligible receives it. So we have what is essentially a housing lottery system in our country, where only the lucky 20% gets the help that they need.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is now recognized.